Thank you everyone for joining our webinar tonight. This is about the Sierra Club and Impacted Landowners' new report, Water Woes, Uncovering the True Water Cost of Summit's Pipeline Project. Tonight, we are going to give you an overview of the report. We'll talk about the implications for Iowa, some of the methodology that we used to put together these numbers, and some of the laws that we believe DNR is not adequately following. This report was put together by a group of us that have been working for the last 6 months or so, crunching the numbers and doing research to figure out exactly how much water Summit's going to need if their project is approved. We want to send a big thanks to Don Johansson, who you'll hear from later. He's an impacted landowner who crunched a lot of the numbers. And then Jessica Wiskus, another impacted landowner who's helped on a lot of the research and editing. And then we also have Wally Taylor, our legal chair here at the Sierra Club, who will be doing a review of Iowa law around water withdrawal. And then Steve Vasey, who also helped review some of the numbers that we put together for the report. So with that, we will get started. So Sierra Club Iowa chapter and impacted landowners Don Johansson and Jessica Wiskus released a report exposing the true water cost of Summit's carbon pipeline project. Over the last 3 years, we've been raising the alarms about carbon pipelines, and the risks to us and our environment continue to grow. Not only is Summit's pipeline dangerous, it's an abuse of eminent domain, it's not a climate change solution, and it threatens to drain our aquifers and create a looming water crisis in Iowa. Summit has hidden its water needs throughout the entire process. They don't want the public to know how much water they need. Late last year, we found out that Summit had begun applying for water withdrawal permits from the Iowa DNR. One permit for Summit in Lawler was approved before the public was aware. A second application in Goldfield is still pending after massive public outcry. Summit has paused all other water permitting since we started exposing their water needs. Summit needs water during the capture process to cool the systems that compress the CO2 from a gas to a supercritical liquid. That process creates a lot of heat, and water is needed to cool those systems. If approved, Summit's project in Iowa would need 3.36 billion gallons of water annually to capture CO2 from its 31 partner ethanol plants across the state. 3.36 billion gallons of water is equivalent to adding 10 to 11 new ethanol plants in Iowa. And that's as much water as 529,000 people use annually. If Summit is approved, ethanol production and the CCS equipment at Summit's 31 ethanol plants would use 13.5 billion gallons of water annually. That's the same amount as the entire ethanol industry in Iowa uses today. This is especially alarming because the ethanol industry gets 90% of its water from deep bedrock aquifers. To make it simple, Iowa has two main types of aquifers, alluvial and deep bedrock or confined aquifers. Alluvial aquifers are much shallower. They recharge relatively quickly with rain and precipitation, but deep bedrock aquifers take hundreds, if not thousands of years to recharge, leaving them very vulnerable to being over-withdrawn and drained. 90% of the water for ethanol production comes from those deep bedrock aquifers. And when you compare it to other industries, 40% from industrial commercial comes from our deep bedrock aquifers, 35% for public water systems, and only 1% for power generation. The ethanol industry and the addition of new wells for Summit's carbon capture project threaten our deep bedrock aquifers and our public water supplies. And the scariest thing about this is that the DNR has never done a study of how much water is in our deep bedrock aquifers and how quickly we are depleting it. DNR is asleep at the wheel and failing to do its job of protecting our public water supply. Our public water supply should not be squandered for Summit's carbon capture scam. Last week, we released this report and it got really good coverage all across the state. And guess what? Summit had no comment to our study. Again, they pretend there's nothing to see here. But the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association was quick with a response, and in typical fashion, they responded with deflection and misleading information. Here's what the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association said. 1 inch of rain across Chickasaw County alone equates to 8.8 billion gallons of water, roughly 10 times what is needed for all CCS projects across the state annually. This is an entirely unethical misrepresentation of the facts that the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association needs to retract if they want to have any credibility. The truth is, like we just discussed, the ethanol industry gets 90% of its water from our deep bedrock aquifers. Rain has little, if any, impact on this type of aquifer. Our deep bedrock aquifers, like the Jordan Aquifer, take thousands of years to recharge. An inch of rain in Chickasaw County is not going to impact the Jordan Aquifer. And that is the aquifer that Homeland Energy Solutions, the ethanol plant that Summit wants to hook up to, is connecting to. And it is entirely a moot point for this reason. The Iowa Renewable Fuels Association also said, if they, Sierra Club, truly believe Iowa is in the middle of a water crisis, maybe they should start crunching the numbers on how much water it takes to keep an 18-hole golf course green in August. That is just laughable. Nearly all golf courses requiring water permits obtain their water from rivers and ponds and reservoirs or other alluvial sources, the type of aquifer that recharges quickly with rain. And golf courses are significantly using less water than ethanol and CCS. We're not giving golf courses a pass, but you can't compare apples to oranges. If Iowa Renewable Fuels Association wanted to dispute our numbers, they could have easily shared their data, but instead they blamed golf courses. So what happens when our aquifers are depleted? The risks of over-withdrawing water from the aquifers are tremendous. New wells will have to be dug as wells run dry, potentially costing Iowans hundreds of thousands of dollars. Our communities will be faced with hard decisions to prioritize who gets water. It could be the start of Iowa's very own water wars. And let's keep in mind, this data in our report is only for Summit in Iowa. Our aquifers don't stop at our state borders. If it's approved, Summit will need water in other states too. And water in other states impacts us, and water used in Iowa impacts them. And not to mention that Wolf's ADM ethanol plants are even bigger than any of Summit's. They will need water too if they're approved. It is abundantly clear that the only benefit of the proposed carbon pipeline projects is the profits that the investors will make from our federal tax credits. There is no benefit to our environment, there is no benefit to Iowans, and there is no benefit to our economy. Summit's project and Wolf's project must be denied by the Iowa Utilities Board, and the Iowa DNR or any other water authority must deny any water permits for Summit and Wolf. Next up, you're going to hear from Don Johansson, who is the person behind a lot of the math and numbers in the report. He's an impacted landowner who has been fighting the pipeline for 3 years now, and he's going to discuss some of the methodology and how we came to our number of 3.36 billion for Summit. So thank you, Don, and go ahead.
All right, well, thank you, Jess. As Jess said, I'm a landowner affected by the Summit pipeline. My farm's located in Cherokee County, just a few miles southeast of the little town of Quimby. There are so many reasons to be against these sequestration pipelines, but the extraordinary water use of the ethanol industry is at the top of the list. Initially, my intent was to determine just the impact of the proposed Summit CO2 capture system, the impact that would have on the water usage of Iowa. But early on, I realized that the entire water and energy footprint of an ethanol plant was something the public should be made aware of. The purpose of the analysis is to determine the amount of water currently used to produce ethanol, include the additional water that will be required to capture the CO2, and then compare that amount to the personal water use of the cities in the surrounding area. One of the more challenging aspects when preparing this analysis was finding reliable firsthand values for water usage and ethanol production, as well as the actual personal water use by the cities. This analysis uses the most reliable and accurate information I could find. There are quite a few numbers used in the analysis. Some are straightforward, but others are more embedded and require additional calculations to flush out. I will show the numbers and sources used in the analysis in the following slides. So for affected area, I assumed an area with a radius of 10 miles around each ethanol plant. City populations was easy. I used the Iowa map. And if the town was too small to show a population, I just assumed a population of 50. For those overlapping areas, there's two plants. One overlaps South Dakota, the other Minnesota. I just did the Google search to get the population of those cities. Ethanol plant, ethanol production. I used the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association reported plant capacity. That's capacity and not necessarily production, but that was the best I could find, and that was downloaded from their website in March of 24. The next slide shows for water use per city. I started with the DNR, it's the WACOP database, and you can, that's a public source, you can search by city. And what we found was that some cities in Iowa show just very high water usage values, up to 9 times the personal water use. So they're obviously providing water to other users. And we know for a fact that some cities are providing water to ethanol plants. And that would avoid the DNR oversight for an ethanol plant to get a water permit. So because the cities use water for other than personal water use, we used a value of 70 gallons per person per day times the population, and that's how we calculated equivalent personal water use. The water used for ethanol production, in the early 2000s, the U.S. Department of Energy funded a study to better understand the methods and requirements to capture and sequester CO2. The study was performed in Illinois. The amount of water used to capture the CO2 was obtained from the study, and that was reported in the Illinois State Geological Survey Report Circular 595 that was published in 2018. Using the reported value of water flow rates, CO2 capture, and ethanol production, a ratio of 1.05 gallon of water per gallon of ethanol was obtained. And it should be noted that this study started in 2003. They released an initial report in 2006 and then followed up with another report in 2018, and that's the one I use. So this report represents 15 years of experience with CO2 capture and was the best source of information we could find for that. So knowing the city personal water use and the ethanol plant water use, we constructed a pie chart of each of the 31 plants on the Summit pipeline. So this one, I chose this one because it's Marcus. That's about 25 miles north of my farm. It's a big plant in a rural area. Its ethanol capacity is 161 million gallons a year. If you start at the 12 o'clock position on the pie chart, you can see that we plotted the water use in percent in increasing levels of water usage. So in the light green, for example, is Remsen that used 42.9 million gallons a year, 4.8% of the total. If you go clockwise from there, you have the bright red, and the bright red on these charts will always be the ethanol plant water for ethanol production. This is 2023 reported numbers, so that's what they're actually using today. So you can see that this plant uses almost 646 million gallons a year at 72% of the total. Further around clockwise in the shaded red area, that's the water used for the CO2 capture. That's the 1.05 gallon per gallon, and that's 18.9%. So if you add the 18.9 and the 72, you get 91%. And a text box on the upper right, that's where it says 91% of the total water will be used by the plant and cities within the surrounding 10-mile radius. And below that is we calculated the equivalent water usage. So like in terms of water, this plant uses enough water to supply a city of 31,900. And for reference, that's about the size of Marshalltown. For electricity, it uses enough electricity for 36,000 people. That's about like Bettendorf. For natural gas, it's 104,000, and that's about like the city of Davenport. And then the lower right-hand corner shows the population of the cities within that 10-mile radius, and that's only 3,208. So these plants are using just an enormous amount of water, electricity, and natural gas. And then just to go through the rest of the chart on the lower or center left-hand side, that's stating the 91% a different way. So the plant will use 9 times as much water as the cities. And on this plant, this was actual water usage. So the ratio is 4 gallons of water per gallon of ethanol, and then an additional 1.05 for CO2 capture. So this plant draws its water from the Devonian aquifer. Uh, that's a confined aquifer, and according to a chart from the DNR, the water level in that area has been stable since 2015. So the next slide is a similar thing. Both of these are big plants in rural areas. So this is the Valero plant near Elbert City, 135 million gallons per year. Again, you see the cities plotted in an order of increasing usage. Uh, Again, the water used for ethanol production was 67%, for CO2 capture is 23.5%, and those total 91%. So, and then the combined equivalent usage for water is 21,400, electricity 30,200, natural gas 87,750. And compare those numbers to the total population in that area, it's like 2,239. So again, the enormous footprint in the rural area. This one, it uses 3 gallons of, 3 gallons of water. That's because this one didn't, the reported use was less than what 3 was. So I used the greater of either 3 gallons of water or the actual numbers. So this one was one I used a ratio of 3. And this is from the Cretaceous aquifer. And that water level's been stable in the last 8 years. So each of the 31 plants in the Summit pipeline will have its own individual pie chart like this. So the next slide shows if you combine all the 31 Summit ethanol plants, and there's 190 cities in those 31 10-mile circles, and those cities use 39% of the water. Water level for ethanol production is 46, and that's a little over 10 billion. Water for CO2 capture, that's at 3.365 billion that Jess mentioned earlier, or 15%. You add those two together, you get to 13.5, and Jess mentioned that. So across all 31 plants, the Summit plants would use 61% of the total water used by plants and cities. So for every gallon of water the city gets, the plant would get 1.5. If you look up the equivalent usage, water is enough for 529,000 people. For electricity, 717,000 people. For natural gas, over 2 million people. And just for reference, the population of the state of Iowa is only 3,200,000. So like 66% of the population is how much natural gas they use. Overall, it was like 3.2 gallons. So that's a quick summary of what we did for the ethanol plants. So now moving on to a different subject. And this is, we're trying to compare alluvial versus aquifer water source. So when we prepared this chart, we started out with the water levels or water usage values reported in I think it's 19 July 2023 in their stakeholders meeting. And they had 10 categories, and they're listed on the left-hand side. So, and the next column over is the water level or water usage they reported. So like ethanol production was like 7,653 million. The next column over is we adjusted that because we know that some water is being provided by cities to the ethanol production. So that's the 13.5 we talked about. And if you go through by categories, there's 33 water permits in ethanol production. One of those was a Cargill plant in Eddyville, and that one uses or produces a different chemical, not ethanol. So I didn't use that one. So I sampled 32 permits. Of the 32 permits, 5 were alluvial for 701 million, 27 were aquifer for a total of 6,952 million gallons per year. So the total number I sampled was 7,653, which is 100% of the ethanol production. So I looked at all of those. So in terms of usage, It's 9.2% alluvial, 90.8% aquifer. So for my analysis, I rounded that off to 10% and 90%. So we'll look briefly at the next one, heating and cooling. I didn't do 100% sample on all of them. So in that one, there's 111 permits. I sampled 20, 6 were alluvial, 14 were aquifer. By usage over there is 32.6% alluvial, 67% aquifer, and I use 30 and 70. The other one I want to look at on this chart, because if you look at just total water usage, power generation, second one from the bottom there, that is by far and away the largest user of water in the state, 491 million, well, 491 billion gallons. And there was 20 permits, and I looked at all 20. And if you go by usage, over on the right, you can see that for power generation, 99.1% of the water was alluvial, only 0.9% was aquifer. So I used 99 and 1. So showing that in a different way, this is the bar chart. So you can see in terms of usage, or in terms of percentage, ethanol production at 90% is the highest one, followed by heating and cooling. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see the quarry and power generation are by far the biggest user for alluvial instead of aquifer. And then the other thing I want to point out on this is that, so this is by percentage, but by usage, ethanol is the third highest user of aquifer water. So I'd like to note that it should be noted that the largest user of water in the state is for power generation. An analysis of all 20 water permits yielded the result that 99% of the water used for power generation is from alluvial sources, which are quickly recharged with rainfall, and from sources that can be readily monitored. If the river level is low, you know it right away. They take the water from the river, run it through their heat exchangers, and then return it back to the river 10 to 12 degrees warmer. They diffuse the water when they return it back to minimize any impact to wildlife in the river. In a sense, the power plant do not use the water, but borrow it. Ethanol plants, on the other hand, take 90% of their water from the confined bedrock aquifers that take hundreds, if not thousands of years to recharge, and the amount of water in the aquifer is an unknown. They don't know how much water was there. They don't know how much water is there and how much longer the water is going to last. So the ethanol plants take the water, boil most of it away, and then dump the discharge into ditches like garbage. So say it again, ethanol plants take the water that's been there for thousands of years that you can pump out of the ground and give to a newborn baby. They boil most of it away, then they add a little bit of triethylene glycol to it, maybe some lubrication oil, and then they just dump the rest into the garbage. Power plants use the water you fish in and return it back to the original source a few minutes later. So when you're talking to the people in your local ethanol boards, ask them why they can't use alluvial water sources like the power generation plants do. So this has been a very quick summary of the analysis. Hopefully the very large footprint these ethanol plants have in water usage, particularly bedrock aquifer water usage, will be apparent. And hopefully we'll get the necessary attention from the public to address the changes that are required.
Thank you very much, Don, and thanks for all your hard work over the last few months. Next up, we have Wally Taylor. Wally Taylor is the Conservation Chair and Legal Chair for the Sierra Club Iowa chapter, and he is one of the top experts in the state of law regarding environmental rules and laws. So thank you, Wally, for looking into DNR withdrawal rules and laws and seeing how they're doing on enforcing those. So take it away.
Okay, thank you. Iowa law is designed, or at least is supposed to protect our groundwater by requiring any entity that wants to withdraw more than 25,000 gallons of groundwater per day to get a permit from the Iowa DNR. Now, the Iowa DNR has the duty to protect Iowa's water resources for the beneficial use of the people of Iowa. The Iowa legislature has mandated that the wise use, protection, and conservation of Iowa's water resources are of paramount importance to the welfare and prosperity of the people of Iowa. The DNR's own regulation states that the waste or unreasonable use be prevented and the conservation and protection of water resources be required for the beneficial use in the interest of the people of Iowa. Instead, over the years, DNR has been handing out water permits like candy, with no consideration of the impact on our groundwater resources. In all the years the DNR has had the duty to protect Iowa's groundwater, it has never denied a permit, and that's something over 2,000 permits. The problem is that the DNR bases its permitting on just 10 use categories. The only water use categories listed are animal feeding or dairy operations, ethanol production, heating and cooling, industrial or commercial, crop irrigation, golf courses and country clubs, power generation, public water supply, quarry operation, and recreational water. These use categories are limited and arbitrary. There is nothing in the statutes or the regulations that specify those categories nor justify limiting the DNR's review to just those uses. As noted above, the privilege of using the public water resource is available only for beneficial use, and there is nothing in the statutes or regulations that defines a beneficial use in terms of categories. Each specific application for water withdrawal must be evaluated on its own merits. For example, the data discussed previously shows that water use for an ethanol plant might range from 195 million gallons per year to 646 million gallons per year. The larger ethanol plant's water withdrawal should not be approved just because it's an ethanol plant. It will certainly have a bigger impact than the smaller ethanol plant. But that is how the DNR views its obligation. If one ethanol plant gets a permit, they all get a permit, or any other of these categories of uses. When the DNR issues a permit, it prepares a summary report, but these are cursory, two-page conclusions with no supporting evidence provided. There's no reference to the amount of water in the aquifer from which the water would be drawn, nor how the requested withdrawal would impact the aquifer. The reports conclude with a boilerplate statement that the ability and intent of the applicant to devote a reasonable amount of water to the beneficial use seem evident. That conclusion cannot be evident without supporting evidence. And as Jess said, the problem is we don't know the status of our aquifers, how much water is in there, and how much the water can be withdrawn safely. The Iowa legislature in this past session did appropriate $250,000 for the Iowa Geological Survey to do a study. But that amount of money is a drop in the bucket. We need more annual reviews of the status of our aquifers. And now we are burdened with Governor Reynolds' Executive Order 10. The executive order requires all state agencies to repeal and then revise all of their rules so the rules use fewer words, fewer restrictive terms, and are less burdensome on the entities that are supposed to be regulated to protect the public and the environment. In other words, an entity like Summit would have an even easier time, if that's possible, of getting a permit because of this executive order. Furthermore, if the governor does not like a proposed rule, she can prevent it from even being drafted and presented for public comment. So even if the DNR wanted to issue better rules to protect our water, the governor can prevent that. And the important aspect of public involvement and public comment and information is precluded. But the DNR can still use its existing rules, even if they are not as strong as we would like. So DNR must take its duty to protect Iowa's water resources more seriously. Our report here shows exactly why that must be required. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wally. Next up, I'm going to kind of talk about what the implications for Iowa are. So the water in our rivers, streams, lakes, and aquifers, Iowa law says, is public water and public wealth of the people of the state. Water's for all of us. It is our public wealth because water is life. And that life is in abundance in Iowa. We are a state whose history and economy has been defined by the plants, the animals, and the families who flourish here, all drawing upon the gift of waters that we thought could never dry up. But Summit Carbon Solutions wants the public wealth of our waters. One company increasing water consumption across the state of Iowa by over 3 billion gallons per year. And the Iowa DNR already granted one of their permits at Lawler without even knowing how much water we have available in our bedrock aquifers. That's like distributing our public wealth, writing a check without knowing how much balance is in the account. What we do know from research conducted under the auspices of the Iowa Geological Survey is that water levels are declining, for example, the Jordan Aquifer. And this water can't be easily recharged. This water has been found to be between tens of thousands to 100,000 years old. To draw upon the waters of bedrock aquifers is to draw upon a resource formed at the very basement of time. We will never see the replenishment of such aquifers in our own era. What is important about the work that we are releasing to you now is that the impact on our communities by withdrawal of water from our aquifers for ethanol and CCS is being measured for the first time. Further study is needed, but what we've uncovered here today aligns with what independent academic researchers have been saying for years. According to a peer-reviewed scientific journal, large-scale deployment of carbon capture and storage could double the water footprint of humanity. And with relevance to the carbon pipelines proposed for Iowa, specifically, the authors tell us bioenergy with CCS, that's what's being proposed here in Iowa. The CCS is the carbon capture and sequestration. The bioenergy refers to, in our case, ethanol. Bioenergy with CCS is the technology that has the highest water footprint per ton of CO2 captured. The highest water footprint per ton of CO2 captured. Indeed, in the article from a previous year, the authors conduct a systematic review of dozens of peer-reviewed scientific articles that analyze the technology and its water requirements and tell us it has already become a consensus that bioenergy carbon capture and storage imperils available water. They conclude that a conflict between increased bioenergy carbon capture and storage application and water security is inevitable. That is what we're beginning to understand now through our report on water use in Iowa. It is imperative that we investigate locally the water woes that the scientific community has warned us about as inevitable. And so we are initiating this conversation. We're bringing this report forward because the voices of the waters themselves are silent voices. We are here to speak on their behalf, and this is what we ask. We are asking for a thorough study of Iowa's aquifers by the Iowa DNR in cooperation with the Iowa Geological Survey. We ask that the Iowa legislature fund an aquifer study annually. We ask that as the DNR revises their rules this year, that they make sure water is not being drawn from our aquifers. We want to make sure that water is only for beneficial use and that those water permits are evaluated carefully on a case-by-case basis. We ask that DNR deny all water permits for carbon capture requested by Summit, Wolf, or any other company. And finally, we ask that the Iowa legislature clarify that phrase, beneficial use, in Iowa code. Means simply what it says, the use of public water as a public wealth of the people of the state must be of beneficial use to the public in the public interest. Our waters belong to everyone in the state. Let us work together to protect them for generations to come. Thank you. So thank you everyone for attending the webinar. We will have time for Q&A, so feel free to put those questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. And while those questions are coming in, I want to show you where you can find these materials on your own because there's a lot to look at. So I'm going to share my screen quick, and I will put this link in the chat, but it's sierraclub.org/Iowa/water report. And I'll put that in the chat. And here on this website, we have a list of all the materials available. We have a fact sheet. We have the report, the appendix for the report, and then the report with the appendix. We have the charts for 31 ethanol plants, so that way you can see ethanol plant by ethanol plant, how much water they're using. The copy of the press release we sent out, graphics that you can share on social media. We have information on the methodology, and then the recording of the press conference that we did last week. So we encourage you to go to this website and take a look at the materials. We could really use some letters to the editor. So if you feel drawn to write something about how important it is that we protect our water, that is highly encouraged. So I'm going to put the link to that in the chat, and then we will start with some of the questions. All right. First question is, Ms. Wally, is one for you. I thought that the DNR many years ago denied a gravel mine using its water to sell to a facility that ended up in another state. That's the Patterson Sand one.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe more than that now. But the Patterson Sand Company in Clayton County wanted to withdraw millions of gallons from the Jordan aquifer, which is near the surface in northeast Iowa, and send that water out west for use out there. The DNR never actually denied that permit. They kept asking Patterson Sand for more information after the Sierra Club objected and kept raising concerns about it. And the Patterson's scheme was that there were some sort of possible credits for sending water out west, like the tax credits for CCS kind of. But then that the credit scheme fell on some questionable determinations, and so Patterson just said it wasn't worth it, and they gave up. But the DNR never actually denied that permit.
Thank you, Wally. We do have one person on the phone with their hand raised, so they're not able to use the chat. So I'm going to unmute Leland. So Leland, go ahead and ask your question. Let's see, you may have to unmute yourself. Try *6. There we go. You're off mute. Can we hear you? Oh, Leland, I'll come back to you in a little bit and see if we can hear you because we can't hear you right now.
Sorry.
We had some feedback there. Hey Pins is asking, do we know how much a water survey will cost compared to how much it's allocated?
I haven't seen any real numbers, but I'm sure that to do an adequate job, it would be in the millions. That's why I say the $250,000 is a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be a lot more than 250,000. All right, next question, can you allow the chat to be saved? Yes, I can. Actually, no, I'm not sure I can change that setting in the middle of a webinar. But I will email everyone who's attended the webinar tonight with a link to that water report. So I'm assuming that's what you're looking for. So I'll make sure that everyone gets that via email. Leland, we've got some feedback whenever you come off of mute. I'm not sure if you have your computer and your phone on, but it might be something caused by that. Wally, there's another question. I think this is a follow-up to Patterson Sand. Does the current situation relate to what happened in the past?
I'm not sure what that question means exactly, but there really hasn't been anything like this in the past, as far as we know. No one's ever done a study like this, and that's why the study is important, I think, because we need to really make sure that our state agencies are adequately determining what the groundwater availability is, what our aquifers are like, and to make sure that the permits are granted only if appropriate.
Absolutely. Do we have any other questions? Don or Wally, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
No?
So Wally, I had heard that the DNR had said they were going to start studying, particularly the Jordan Aquifer. And I think that was like a year ago. Are you aware of any permits that have been canceled like in the last year that would make you believe that they're getting serious about monitoring water use?
No.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. I think the most important, oh, we just have a question come in here quick. Is it possible for satellites to determine the aquifers other than their size underground?
No.
No.
I mean, the whole aquifer thing is just incredibly complicated. They're like layer cake, and they all flow like from the northeast to the southwest, and then they have what they call potentiometry studies and that's like for a confined aquifer. If you stop pumping and let the water rise to its natural level, that would give you an indication. But for that to do that, then you have to stop pumping at these sites. And to do that, you have to shut the water down for like the ethanol plant or the city. And it gets complicated very quickly. But no, you need hands on the ground and I mean, just the incredible number of data points across the state to monitor each one.
Yeah, there are maps in our report that show the overlapping nature of these aquifers and how they layer on top of each other as you go from one area of the state to another. So as Don says, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
Don, we just had another question come in. Do we know how much water in Iowa is used by CAFOs for animal feeding operations?
I mean, for the ones that have permits, let me see once. It's so that'd be the animal feeding operation. So that's like 4 billion. Yeah, there you go.
And
so you look at that and compare, and it's what, 60% alluvial, which is a good thing because we've seen how quickly the alluvial source can replenish. Just look at Iowa the last 3 or 4 weeks. So anyway, 4 billion gallons compared to everything else, it's a pretty small number, and it's mostly alluvial.
Yeah. And keep in mind the DNR withdrawal permits are only issued to facilities that use 25,000 gallons of water in any given day in a calendar year. So these numbers could be larger when you look at the facilities that wouldn't require a permit from the DNR.
Mhm.
I think we've got a few more questions in here. Let's see. Could a study be shared with other states? But you're more
This
than
study?
welcome to share the study with anyone, but whether we
Yeah.
get numbers calculated, it takes quite a bit of work. And I think that there is some discussion, I guess, Don, I'll let you say, there is some discussion of expanding this to a few other states as well.
Yeah, that's come up with the Summit project and North Dakota, particularly South Dakota, we'd like to do the same thing. But like Jess said, that's quite a bit of work, so need some time for that. The other thing we need to do, there's 42 ethanol plants in the state of Iowa, 31 are on the Summit route, and I'd like to do those other 11 plants and just see what they look like, particularly the big ADM plants in Cedar Rapids and Clinton.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you everyone for attending the webinar. Bottom line is that we have a limited resource that we rely on for life that is being squandered by a private company that's just trying to make money off of our federal tax credits. And this water is particularly scary because they're taking the water from our deep bedrock aquifers. And it's really important to understand the difference between our alluvial and our deep bedrock aquifers, because some can be replenished relatively quickly and others cannot. So we have to do everything that we can here in Iowa to stop these permits from being issued and stop the carbon pipelines altogether. So one thing that would really help is sharing this report on social media, sharing it with your legislators, your supervisors, your city council members, anyone you can think of, and then writing a letter to the editor as well to get the word out to the public. That is how we're going to spread the word and get enough people active to be able to stop these permits from being issued. So I will send an email tomorrow to everyone who's attended the webinar with a link to the report page so you can look at all of the materials. And if you have any questions, please get a hold of us. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.